مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. حرب في أوكرانيا، حرب في الشرق الأوسط، وحرب على الهجرة غير الشرعية عبر الحدود الجنوبية. ويأتي كل هذا بعد إنهاء إدارة الرئيس بايدن للحرب في أفغانستان، والتي كانت جزءاً حيوياً من الحرب على الإرهاب. إنه كم هائل من الحروب، كما يلوح في الأفق خطر آخر على أمريكا، على مصالحها وأسلوب حياتها. خطر أكبر بكثير من كل تلك الحروب، وهو ما يطلق عليه الخبراء التحدي الاستراتيجي الكبير في القرن 21، التهديد من الصين. ما مدى خطورة التهديد من الصين الشيوعية؟ هل الصين منافس، خصم أم عدو؟ هل نحن في قدم حرب باردة جديدة؟ وهل نربحها في الوقت تتزاحم فيه المواضيع على الأجندة السياسة الخارجية؟ سنناقش في حلقة هذا الأسبوع من برنامج داخل واشنطن ما قد يكون أهم موضوع، وهو التحدي الصيني، مع رئيس اللجنة المختصة بالحزب الشيوعي في مجلس النواب عضو الكونغرس مايك Gallagher. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. With wars raging in the Middle East and Europe, with brouhaha over our southern border, people tend to forget what might be the most important strategic challenge facing America, certainly one looming on the horizon, and that's the challenge of China. I'm delighted to welcome today someone who focuses much of his time on Capitol Hill addressing this vital question. Congressman Mike Gallagher, welcome to Dakhel, Washington. Congressman Gallagher is the chairman of the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, and he's chairman of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Cyber Information Technology and Innovation. That's quite a lot. Mike, if I may, Congressman Gallagher, you're a congressman from Green Bay, Wisconsin, right there in the middle of America, known for football and cheese. Why do you focus on China?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you. Really looking forward to this conversation. When I came into Congress in 2016, my background was as a military officer, specifically a Marine Corps officer, and I found myself on the Armed Services Committee consumed with questions about the future of the Navy and the Marine Corps, which inevitably led to an exploration of what was happening in the Indo-Pacific region. Because at the time, we were very much trying to reduce our presence and posture in the CENTCOM or Middle East region and focus more on the rising threat posed by China. So it's because of that interest in military issues that I then started to explore what was happening with China. This was not an area of focus for me in my career prior to Congress. I focused mostly on the Middle East. And then I became co-chair of something called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, where we looked at the future of US cyber policy. And that also ended up becoming an exploration of US-China competition in the cyberspace domain. So all of those things kind of led me to this. And then the former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, 2 years ago decided he wanted to create a select committee that would focus solely on China. And he decided that I should be the one to chair the committee, which I've done now for over a year. It's been a very rewarding experience. It's been a bipartisan endeavor, which I think is crucial. That being said, I don't try to suggest I am an expert on China. I just know where all the experts are, and then I steal their ideas, and then I try and craft intelligent or semi-intelligent policy as a result of that.
So, Congressman, how would you describe China? Is it a competitor? Is it a rival? Is it an adversary? Is it an enemy? How do you put it?
I would say they're an adversary. I would say that the Chinese Communist Party is an enemy of freedom wherever it exists. And that's a critical distinction to make between the party and the Chinese people, because I don't think the Chinese people are our enemy. I actually asked the speaker to change the name of the committee to say Chinese Communist Party to reflect the fact that this is a party state, as well as make sure that we weren't unnecessarily stigmatizing China or Chinese people writ large. And I think constantly making that distinction between the party and the people actually improves the efficacy of our policy. And I think if you're uncomfortable with that phrasing, I get it, but look at some of the other attempts to dance around the issue, and they come off as rhetorically absurd, right? In America, we have this complicated language about, well, we're going to compete with them in some areas, but we're going to cooperate in others. In the UK, they've called China an epoch-defining systems challenge, which is unnecessarily complicated. So they need not be our adversary, but the party, and Xi Jinping specifically, keeps acting in ways that are hostile to American interests, in my humble opinion.
So when you think of them as an adversary, is this in the military realm, in the economic realm, ideologically, culturally, all of the above?
All the above. I think what makes this threat more complex than the threat we faced from the Soviet Union is that it's not just a military threat in the way the Soviet threat was. Its economic power is much greater than that of the Soviet Union. And uniquely, we find ourselves thoroughly economically entangled with the Chinese Communist Party in a way we never were with the Soviet Union. We never had to contemplate a form of selective decoupling or de-risking because our economies didn't interact. And I think, thirdly, ideologically, and this is a point of debate within my own party, I do think that, let me put it this way. If you examine what Xi Jinping has said after he has studied the fall of the Soviet Union, he had this famous speech in 2012 or 2013, right? He was coming to power, where he said that the Soviet regime collapsed because of insufficient commitment to ideology. And I think what he's actually trying to do is sort of prove that their model of governance and all of the ideological commitments to the party and Xi Jinping thought that come with that are superior to our model of self-government in America. And so in that way, only looking at this through the prism of military competition, I think misses something very important about what's going on here.
Is it your view that a clash is inevitable with a communist-led China?
Not inevitable. I think there's still a window of opportunity to deter the Chinese Communist Party from trying to take Taiwan, which is probably the most likely flashpoint that would lead to a military clash. And certainly it's not inevitable that what could be called a Cold War needs to turn hot in other areas. It's not inevitable, even in my opinion, that the party will continue its aggressive and predatory behavior. Now, under Xi Jinping, it seems likely, but Xi Jinping is getting up there in age. There could be a change in leadership, and different things could happen. So I'm not suggesting that we're on this inexorable collision course. I think we could do things to prevent that from happening, enhancing near-term deterrence and long-term competitiveness. But it's very difficult, and it's going to cost time and money in order to prevent certainly a kinetic confrontation between these two superpowers. And I just want to say, in addition to that the reason that's so important is because any collapse of deterrence and outbreak of conflict between the United States and China would be incredibly destructive economically, in terms of lives lost. It's almost hard for us to fathom the scale of that destruction, which should energize our efforts to preserve the peace by enhancing deterrence.
So you mentioned Taiwan a moment ago, and I want to ask you about this because around the world, there's been a movement over the last number of decades countries that had relations with Taiwan. Very few of them still maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan. They just lost one of theirs just a week ago or so. The United States, under Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, reached a one China policy with Beijing more than 50 years ago. What is so important to America about Taiwan?
At least, well, a few things. One, there are economic interests, right? Taiwan is a global superpower when it comes to semiconductor manufacturing. And if there were to be an attempted takeover of Taiwan, at a minimum, it would be incredibly disruptive and destructive to the global economic system. Everything in your house that has an on and off switch might have a component made in Taiwan. And certainly if China were somehow able to absorb Taiwan and retain that productive capacity in TSMC, it would have the ability to hold the rest of the world economic hostage. That's point one. Point two, I think it's fair to say that Las Vegas rules don't apply. What happens in Taiwan would not stay there. A successful CCP invasion of Taiwan would make it impossible from a military sense for America to fulfill its treaty commitments in the region, most notably with the Philippines and Japan. And I think it is the goal of the party, and Xi particularly, to have regional dominance, to have regional hegemony, and I would argue eventually global primacy. So it would not just be contained to Taiwan. And then finally, though we've had a very brutal debate in America over the nature of democracy promotion in our foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, we're dealing with something different here, which is the defense of an existing thriving democracy from authoritarian aggression. And I would submit, at the risk of getting a little too moralistic, if America doesn't stand for that, for holding the line, not overturning the status quo, but just defending it from such authoritarian aggression, then we stand for nothing. And it would dramatically reduce our credibility around the world. So those are kind of the top three reasons I think Taiwan matters.
I think it's very important for you to be able to lay that out. I think that's very useful. Thank you. Now,
in part, if I could, because I don't think it's obvious to everybody, right? Here in where I am right now in Wisconsin, I mean, it's just not something that's on people's daily radar screens. And so I do think people in positions like mine have to do a better job of making the case if we want support from the American people for the actions necessary to help Taiwan defend itself.
And just on that last point, do you think we're making progress in convincing, your constituents and people in Middle America that this is an important priority for America?
I think on the China issue more broadly, yes, it's hard to disaggregate Taiwan from that. But I think your average American, certainly in Wisconsin, is starting to see the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party due to a combination of the intellectual property theft that's been going on for years and years now, the effect of China's predatory economic practices on the industrial Midwest, and the way in which the COVID pandemic upended everybody's lives. And whether you think it was it came from a lab in Wuhan or came from a wet market nearby, the fact is that the Chinese Communist Party was not transparent in how they managed it early on, and that lack of transparency, the cover up, regardless of the origin, cost us time and millions of lives. We've also had high-profile incidents like the spy balloon incident, for example, which was a wake-up call for Americans. So in that sense, we're making some progress, but I think we have a long way to go in terms of generating support, for example, for key transformational investments in our own military to help enhance deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. And so that's where we still have some homework to do.
Okay, when we come back after the break, I'm going to ask Congressman Gallagher about another global crisis, the war in Ukraine, and whether it is essential as a precursor to dealing with China, or is it a diversion from addressing the threat in China? In just a moment. Again, my guest today is Congressman Mike Gallagher. Mike has represented Wisconsin's 8th District in the U.S. House of Representatives since 2017. Born and raised in Green Bay, home of the celebrated Packers, my favorite football team as a child, before the Patriots began their winning ways, Mike has served 7 years on active duty in the United States Marine Corps, including 2 deployments to Iraq. Mike also served as the lead Republican staffer for the Middle East and for counterterrorism on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He then made the jump from staffer to representative. Mike is not only one of the smartest people in Congress, he's one of the best educated too, with a bachelor's degree from Princeton, master's from Georgetown, a second master's in security intelligence from the National Intelligence University, and a doctorate in international relations from Georgetown. So, Mike, let me ask you about Ukraine and China, because there's some measure of a debate about this. Some analysts say that the urgency of the China threat, look at the urgency of the China threat and say Ukraine is a drain or a diversion. Others say if we don't deal with Ukraine, we don't respond to Russian aggression, it's just a welcome mat for Beijing. Where do you come out on this?
I think they're linked. I don't think it's a diversion. I think that China and Xi are paying close attention to the outcome on the ground in Ukraine, as are our allies in Asia, right? The two key Asian countries, China and Japan, are paying intense attention to what's happening in Eastern Europe.
Let me ask you about a different aspect of this, the intersection of your China focus and your cyber focus in the popular realm. And this is something that touches millions and millions of Americans and Middle Easterners alike. TikTok. Is TikTok a strategic threat in your view?
I think so. And that's not just me as, hawkish Republican. Every Biden administration national security official has said that TikTok represents a national security threat. And the threat is not just the threat of spying, right? Or that it could track your location or what websites you're visiting, which it can do and has been caught doing that, even against journalists. The more insidious threat is the fact that TikTok, particularly for the younger generation, is a news platform. And we have to ask ourselves the question of whether we want a company that's owned by ByteDance, a Chinese company that is beholden to the Chinese Communist Party, to be the dominant media platform in America. I don't think we want that. I mean, the risk of misinformation, of election interference would be far too great. And I think there's a way in which we could compel a separation between TikTok and China, which is called Douyin, and TikTok US, and cut off all the plumbing between them, and have an American company take control of TikTok US with control of the algorithm that addresses that national security concern. And then we would be left fighting over the issue of whether social media in general is healthy for us, which of course it is not. And as a parent, this terrifies me, but that's a separate question than the national security threat that TikTok poses because of its unique ownership structure. And that's what makes it different than Instagram or another American social media app.
Very good. So you mentioned a moment ago that not just Republican Mike Gallagher, but Democratic national security officials have a similar view of this. How would you evaluate the overall sense of bipartisanship on the issue of China? I know your committee is very bipartisan. How would you evaluate what the Biden administration has been doing on China?
Well, it's a mixed bag. There's elements of first of all, I do think there's a deep reservoir of bipartisanship on this issue. That's not to say the parties agree on everything. There's deep disagreements about the relative prioritization of climate change in our relationship with China, for example. There is a tendency to prioritize identity politics on the Democrat side that I think is counterproductive, but there's a ton of agreement. And then there's inter-party disagreements on my side, right? On issues like trade and restrictions on US investments in China. So, but by and large, I think there's a bipartisan foundation. The Biden administration, there's elements that I've been very supportive of. For example, I give them enormous credit for the AUKUS agreement. This is the agreement between us, the Brits and the Aussies on sharing sensitive nuclear submarine technologies, whether some other advanced technology. Amazing. It has the potential to be transformative. I've been so enthusiastically in support of it. Now, there's a lot that needs to be done to make it successful, but that's been good. There are members of the administration I genuinely admire, like Eli Ratner at DOD, and then people on the National Security Council. But then there's been areas where I've been critical. And I think it's fair to say that the Biden administration, like the Trump administration, is divided on China. There's sort of two factions in the administration that are constantly vying for control, as there was in Trump. And at times that produces a policy incoherence that I think is counterproductive. Overall, my biggest source of criticism has been what I've called zombie engagement. I think this attempt to revive détente or engagement with China as a way of cooling the temperatures prior to an election is going to prove to be counterproductive. And there's a tendency in these negotiations with China where we make concessions up front, we take our foot off the gas in terms of defensive actions we need to take, and they make promises of cooperation in the future that never actually become a reality. And I worry that we're falling for that dynamic again. I could be wrong. Listen, I hope I'm wrong. I hope, we can have a more productive dynamic with the Chinese Communist Party. I just see no evidence of that happening.
All right, Mike, one last question. This show is beaming out to the Middle East. If Middle Easterners are watching this and they hear the intensity of your voice about the urgency of dealing with the challenges of China, they're probably saying to themselves, oh my God, we're going to be a third tier issue for America. If this happens, we're going to be an afterthought. So what do you say to Middle Easterners about this?
Well, I love the Middle East. That's where I spent the early part of my career. And I think recent history has shown that if you ignore the Middle East, or if you succumb to this fantasy that we can just get out of the region, well, China will benefit because China is all over the region trying to expand their influence, and B, there'll be issues that get worse and chaos that emerges that we have to deal with. So I certainly am a passionate advocate for staying forward, engaged in the Middle East, building upon our existing system of alliances and partnerships, because it's a wonderful region that I fell in love with as a young man studying the region. And so we can also do multiple things at one time. We're a superpower. It's not we don't have to choose between worrying about China and worrying about the Middle East. I get that it's hard. I mean, it's hard to do different things, and time is finite for anybody in office in the executive branch or the legislative branch. But what's the old Arabic expression? El-waqt kasayif, idha lam taqtaha qatak. Time is like a sword. If you don't divide it, it will cut you. So you just have to manage your time, and you can do multiple things at once.
Well, it's terrific to have a congressman who actually can cite Arabic proverbs. Congressman Mike Gallagher,
been a while.
Thank you so much for joining us on Dakhil, Washington.
وإلى هنا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم استفسارات أو تعليقات حول البرنامج، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بالدور الصين في الشرق الأوسط، أرجو التواصل معي على تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو مراسلتي مباشرة @RobSatloff. وحتى نلتقي في الأسبوع القادم، شكرا وإلى اللقاء.